Thank you all for coming. We've got an exciting topic to close out the talking this afternoon. As many of you know, the Senate is taking up legislation in early June dealing with climate change. And we've got a panel here to discuss what effective climate legislation ought to look like. We're going to talk about issues such as, should we have it? Should we have targets and timetables, and if so, what are they? One of the key issues in the debate in Washington is that we are creating, if we have a cap-and-trade program, a whole new asset class, a carbon permit or credit or allowance. There's going to be many of them, and they're going to be worth something. And so there's a fairly important issue about how we design the legislation to think about that. And you're going to hear a lot about that from our panel here this afternoon. One of the issues that relates to that is the possible, the government has a couple of basic choices about how to deal with those permits. It can directly allocate them to somebody by some sort of rule or law, or it could auction them, and a range of possibilities of mixing in between. And you're going to hear a lot about that issue here. One of the rules that Mindy Luber set for this panel is that we had to speak English, which may be hard for us because we're all deeply engaged in climate policy wonkdom, but we'll try to keep it to the simple language as much as we can. But we've got a great panel to talk about this issue. To my left is Ralph Izzo, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Public Service Enterprise Group, a utility based in New Jersey. To my immediate right is Jim Rogers, who's the Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Duke Energy, which is based in North Carolina and has operations in both the Carolinas, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Perfect. And David Doniger on my far right, who's the Policy Director for the Climate Center at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and a longtime expert in climate change policy. And you all can read more about them. But we're just going to jump right into it, and I'm going to ask first Ralph, then Jim, and then David to each say a few words about their thoughts on how we should design effective climate policy. Then we're going to turn to a few questions from me, and a little discussion among us, and then we'll turn back to you, and we're going to wrap that all up in the next hour or so. So without further ado, Ralph, take it off. How should we have effective climate policy?
If it's okay with you, David, I'd just like to set a context for that, and I will get us to a specific answer to that question. I was fortunate in the past few weeks to be able to spend some time with Dr. Jim Hansen of the NASA Goddard Space Institute. And Dr. Hansen, many of you will recognize as someone who recognized climate change early on, probably in the late 80s, early 90s. And one of the things he said to us is that if there's been anything that's been wrong with his predictions, it's the fact that they have come true a lot sooner than he expected. So there's an acceleration of the negative impacts of climate change that he and many members of the scientific community have recognized. And he believes, at least, that we can no longer talk about concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and I'll just throw a couple of numbers and then I'll back away from that, of 400 to 500 parts per billion, but we need to be more in the 350 parts per billion stage, which means we need to act now. And we actually need to get to a level where, in designing climate legislation, we would be 80% below where we are today in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so the urgency was quite clear on his part and the part of a lot of scientists who've been engaged in this research. And unfortunately, I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, you can always count on America to do the right thing, but it may take them a little long. And we just don't seem to have that luxury right now. So to create that context, I'd ask you to just think about the following three items for a moment. Item number one, assume that 40 years from now, in 2050, we have not increased our consumption of electricity at all. Now that flies in the face of 100 years of history because electricity consumption has grown with population and GDP, either 1-for-1 or at about a 50% rate. But let's assume we break with the entire history of electricity generation in this country. Assumption number two, we ban any form of transportation that depends on fossil fuels. Not just the 12-mile-per-gallon SUV, the 50-mile-per-gallon Prius, the gasoline and diesel-powered mass transit bus. We do all that. You can walk, you can bike, you can ripstick, you can use whatever non-fossil fuel form of transportation. That's assumption number 2. And then assumption number 3 is we ban any form of device that depends upon electricity. Not just the obnoxious stereo coming from the teenager next door, but the medical diagnostic equipment in hospitals. If you did any one of those 3 things, I think you would say that that's pretty absurd. But now let's assume that you managed to do all 3 of those things. We would miss the 80% reduction target by 2050. So the magnitude of the change that we need to see, and therefore needs to be reflected in the legislation, I don't think the American public has fully come to grips with. This is something that will change lifestyles. This is something that has to change the way economic value is created. And in fact, it's going to have to destroy some things that used to create economic value for us. So I don't want to go on forever, but the 3-pronged approach that we are advocates for, first and foremost, energy efficiency, a genuine case of win-win. Basically what you have today is that people who are supposed to invest in devices that can use electricity more efficiently or use energy more generally more efficiently happen to have another name. They are called consumers. And on a risk-adjusted basis, they're walking away from these investments. They walk away from them because they, quite candidly, don't think that they will achieve the benefits that are promised by these investments, whether it's an energy-efficient water heater or a compact fluorescent bulb. Solution is to correct the flaw in the marketplace and substitute for that ill-informed investor a well-informed investor who today is not allowed to participate in that, your local electric or gas utility. Capture the win-win benefits of energy efficiency by allowing utilities to participate. Priority number 2 needs to be renewable energy supplies. Candidly there, we move from win-win to cost-benefit, but the benefits exceed greenhouse gas emissions. The benefits go to traditional pollutants. They speak to mercury emissions. They speak to SO2 emissions. They speak to fine particulate matters. There, the market sends a very clear signal that it is too expensive as long as the market does not accurately capture the externalities associated with the damage created by those pollutants. So there, the mission needs to be, how do we deliver renewables on a least cost basis? 2 things have to happen. Number 1, you have to reduce the cost of technology. There are far smarter people working on that than I am capable of speaking to, and that will happen. Number 2 is you need to reduce the risk associated with somebody making an investment in something that is above the market price and really only makes sense as long as there are regulatory mechanisms that say this is worth doing. That's a huge regulatory risk, and the average investor therefore demands a huge premium to make that investment. So my response to that is insert an investor who is comfortable taking regulatory risk, understands regulatory risk, has access to capital. By now you can see the theme emerging. Who might that be? Your utility. And we're pleased that New Jersey were just given approval to invest $100 million in solar energy for those very reasons. Item number 3 is wholesale power production. There we think we need some technology advancement to be able to have carbon capture and storage of fossil fuel plants. And we need to keep nuclear on the table only after we've given 110% to the first 2 pieces of the equation. But for any of those technologies to have a shot as the technologies come along, you need to have the legislation in place that puts a price on carbon. For that reason, we are supporters of Warner-Lieberman. We believe it's the closest bill that's out there to getting to the 80% by 2050 level. We are supporters of its allocation method, although candidly we would prefer to see it simplified. We'd rather see 75% be allocated to generators, 25% be auctioned, and have that go to 100% auction within 10 years, and the auction proceeds going to low-income assistance and research and development. And the allocation to generators we'd like to see be made on the basis of output, as opposed to output of electricity as opposed to output of emissions. So that's where we stand on the legislation. The fact of the matter is something needs to happen now, and we see that 3-pronged approach being critical to our industry, and even that, I go back to my original analogy for you about what it will take to get to the 80% level by 2050.
That's great. Can I get you to say a word for everybody about outputs?
Yes, so
just to explain a little further.
Yeah, the reason why we would like to see an allocation made on the basis of output is that what society wants is electricity. At least that's what society has said pretty loudly for 100 years. Society doesn't want mercury emissions. Society doesn't want greenhouse gas emissions. They want electricity. So I think you want to allocate emissions to generators because, at the risk of sounding immodest, I think we're sophisticated investors. So if you send me that price signal, I will react more quickly than a consumer will. And if you send me a signal that says, I will give you this asset, an emission allowance, on the basis of how much electricity you produce, which is a societal benefit, then I'm going to try and maximize my electricity and minimize my greenhouse gas emission. Now, that's going to be the opposite of some folks who are going to want to say, well, that's not fair because nobody thought CO2 was a pollutant 40 years ago, right? And we built plants in the past, and I built plants. I mean, I have 25% of our electricity comes from coal plants, and they're going to be hurt by that. So one has to be a little bit careful about what you're then going to do to consumers and emitters of large amount of CO2 who didn't think that was a problem in the past. And that's the alternate scenario, is not to allocate emissions on the basis of megawatt hours produced, but to allocate emissions credits on the basis of emissions produced, because that's a measure of people who need those credits. That, to me, is a little bit more grandfathering and may not give the same amount of impetus to change, but it will mitigate some of the perhaps unfair costs on people who made investments in the past without the benefit of climate change information.
Great. That's terrific. Jim, do you want to add a few views from your standpoint on how do we design effective climate legislation?
Sure, David, thank you. And I'd start out by saying I agree with much of what Ralph has said. And primarily, I agree with the notion that we need to set as a target a 60 to 80% reduction by 2050, which is embedded in the Lieberman-Warner bill. That makes sense. And I think that we need a sense of urgency about getting going with it. But not only do we need a sense of urgency, we've got to be prepared to have the stick-to-itiveness and the patience to follow through on this over many decades if we're going to achieve this objective. I look at it really two ways to go at it. From a regulatory standpoint, Lieberman-Warner is an example of the direction that we should go, and that's a cap-and-trade approach. Why that is so important from my perspective is, one, it puts a price on carbon. Secondly, it puts a cap on emissions and declines over time. And thirdly, it uses the allowances to help companies and regions of our country, families, businesses, make the transition. And if you remember anything about what I talk about this afternoon, remember the key to being successful in terms of getting legislation started sooner and successful in terms of staying with it through the many decades that we have to work through it, is to get the transition right. Because not everybody in the United States is starting at the same place, and we have to get the transition right in order to achieve our agenda, and that is address the climate issue going forward. So a regulatory strategy is a must. It sends a powerful signal to the rest of the world that we are regulating carbon and we're on the way. The price on carbon, of course, is very important because in terms of making investment, it allows us to make better investments going forward. But the regulatory approach of in itself gets nothing done because, quite frankly, we need to jumpstart a technology revolution for it to really happen. And let me just spend a moment. Tom Friedman had a great line in one of his columns that said, "A vision without resources is an hallucination." I believe a climate policy without rapid development of technology is an hallucination. And quite frankly, that's something that we can go to work on right now. And if you look at the expenditures of the U.S. government on R&D, it's 50% of what it was in the late 70s and early 80s. It's pathetic. We need to really ramp up, and we need to ramp up now. And I think that is a critical thing that needs to get done going forward. Every technology we use to generate electricity in this country needs a technological advance to contribute equally in a low-carbon world. What does that mean? It means coal needs carbon capture and sequestration, and 50% of our generation comes from coal. It means that nuclear, if it's going to be viable, we've got to solve the spent fuel issue, and we've just delayed on that to date. Gas. People think of that as a clean fuel, but the emissions of gas is 50% of coal, and LNG, recent studies show, is on a life cycle basis is almost 75% of the emissions of CO2 of coal. We hadn't even begun to think about how to do that because that could be even more expensive than extracting CO2 from coal. The other thing is renewables. Renewables, to be a contributor, an equal contributor, we need to develop storage technology. If you look at energy efficiency, as I do, as the fifth fuel, because we need to think of it as a production option, as we weigh the different options that we pursue in the future, there's significant development there that's needed with respect to the smart grid, the dashboard, the protocols within the home to really, and the businesses to really advance it. So we need a technology revolution. We need the government to fund it. And quite frankly, the biggest mistake in Lieberman Warner, in my judgment, is that they have coupled the fundraising mechanism with the cap and trade mechanism, and we don't achieve the objectives of either when we do that. Because if you're using the cap and trade mechanism to generate it through auctions, it reduces your ability to use the allowances to help those that are disadvantaged and adversely affected from the legislation to make the transition. And quite frankly, if you decoupled the funding from cap and trade, we could pass legislation this year to put a kilowatt-hour charge on every kilowatt in America. And the reason that I would put a financial charge on each, just with 3 mils, 0.3%, we could raise $11 billion a year. That compares to about 1.5 to 1.7 that's spent in the government today in R&D. And that would make our country the leading country in the world in terms of spending money on technology to allow us to live in a low-carbon world. And we could pass that law this year. We could raise $11 billion next year, $11 billion in 10. And the way to think about it is, under Lieberman Warner, it will not become effective earlier than 12 and most likely 14. And we could raise billions of dollars and go to work on technology while they're debating in Congress about the regulatory plan and while we're getting prepared to put it in place in 12 or later. So if we have a real sense of urgency about this, we would pass legislation this year, we would raise the money, and we'd go to work on technology, because one of the things is absolutely clear. Regulatory policy alone will not get us to a low-carbon world. We've got to have technology, and quite frankly, from my point of view, we really need both. And the last thing I would say as we get into this is I've had a public exchange of letters with Jim Hansen. I haven't had the good fortune to sit down with him yet and have a conversation. I think we're scheduled in May to do that. But I've had a chance to sit and talk to James Lovelock, who wrote The Revenge of Gaia. Had a wonderful breakfast with him. I hope I'm that charming and smart and writing 1,000 words a day and writing another book when I'm close to 90. But he has a great point of view that we are already in adaptation, and there's nothing we're going to do to avoid that. And that he believes that the risk profile of building nuclear compared to the risk of carbon crisis that we're headed toward, these risks are much less, and that there was a time in his career where he didn't think that was the right answer, but seeing the tremendous risk associated with adaptation, that we need to do something dramatic, and that's a technology we can do it with. Also had a chance to have a lunch with E.O. Wilson, the biologist here in Boston. And bottom line is, you look at the number of species every year, it gives you that we're losing. It gives you an even greater sense of urgency, but he recognizes that we're far down the road of adaptation. I know it's not politically correct to talk about that, but the reality is that we are in both mitigation and adaptation, and it's going to take technology in both areas. And we need to have a robust conversation in this country about the interplay of all of them if we're going to make real progress on this issue. But I look forward to y'all's questions and getting into the details of the bill. because my dad was a lawyer. He used to say the devil was in the details. My mom always corrected him and said that God is in the details. I don't know what you think's in the details. I hope I find a little bit of both, and I'm sure in this conversation this afternoon we will.
So, David.
Well, thanks. This whole discussion has moved a great deal over the last 5 years or so. I mean, who would have thought that you could come to a panel like this and have two executives from big power companies and the representative of an environmental group, and I presume also our moderator, agreeing on the general outlines of the depth of the reductions and the urgency of making them that we have got to make if we want to avert real catastrophic climate consequences. And it's true that we're too late to avoid all the consequences, but that only underlines the urgency of acting now to slow the rate at which bad things happen and get a handle on it sooner rather than later. There's evolution in the debate, I think, as well on this question of how the cap-and-trade program should be constructed and how these valuable pollution credits or pollution allowances should be handled. 5 years ago, the predominant assumption is that we should allocate carbon allowances pretty much the same way we did sulfur dioxide allowances. That is, give them away to incumbent polluters, and that's been called grandfathering. There was little discussion back then of the potential for windfalls to be reaped by the owners of power plants and the potential for big transfers from consumers paying higher rates to those companies, and that would be what was generating the windfalls. I think a lot of that has changed. There's a much greater focus on the interests of the consumer, and that's led to, and also on the means to reduce electricity demand, gas demand, as a way of moderating the crunch between the cap and what the electricity or the gas industry wants to put into the air. There's a lot of progress in that regard. There's a growing awareness that I think I might differ a bit with Jim. I think the growing awareness that the allowance value itself, albeit it's not here yet because the bill isn't passed yet, is a huge asset that can be used for public purposes, and that we ought to view any that are grandfathered as a kind of transitional measure, in our view, to be minimized and to be phased out as quickly as possible. But the goal is to use all of this value for consumer benefit. And foremost among that is the deployment of energy efficiency technology. I won't go into detail because Ralph has already touched on that. And also that there is a great value in using this revenue to help bring technologies that are basically ready. They're not fundamentally needful of new research. They're basically ready. They just need to be put together. Companies need to be prepared to take the risks and do the initial experience with full-scale operation. But we could start on that, in our view, with the next plants right away. There's not a need to spend 10 or 20 years perfecting this or demonstrating it in a few sort of hothouse plants. Now, one of the ideas that is gaining some currency is that a lot of the allocation should be made not to entirely to generators, but to the local utility company, the one that you pay your bills to, and the one that the state public utilities commissions regulate. And that ought to come with some strings attached, that the value of that allowance, those allowances should be realized by selling them to the generators and to others who need them to cover their emissions. And that money ought to be used to fund, on a much bigger, massive scale than has been done to date, the retrofit of our homes, our commercial buildings, our manufacturing facilities with energy-efficient equipment to bring down eliminate the growth, and I would even think possibly to shrink the total amount of energy it takes to get the goods and services that we all want. We don't want the electricity per se. I would go further than Ralph. We want the energy service. We want the electricity to run a computer or a television, or the gas to run a heating system. But we don't want the gas or the electricity per se. So I think that is the key principle, is to work out how much of the allowances are going to be, in effect, auctioned and put to public benefit in the form of these efficiency investments and new technology investments, including things like bringing carbon capture to the marketplace faster. And then, you know, I think that one of the principal differences that probably, if you poke us, you'll find here is the question of how much of the value needs to go to the owners of the coal-fired assets. I certainly understand the concern about a rough shock, really rough shock. But some people are envisioning very long cushioning and a very lucrative cushioning. And we need to figure out how we can put most of that allowance value to the consumer's benefit, not to the benefit of shareholders who may or may not have made prudent decisions. You know, it hasn't been just 2 or 3 years ago that we discovered global warming. And if you go back to the 1965 Clean Air Act debates, you find mention of global warming caused by carbon dioxide emissions. And in 1970, the Council on Environmental Quality, in its maiden report to the Congress, had a whole chapter about the risk of modifying the climate due to the emission of CO2. So, as the auctioneer might say, fair warning. And you know, it's not an absolute principle. There's accommodations to be made, and there's a lot of good discussion going on in groups such as the U.S. Climate Action Partnership and many other different ways in which environmental organizations and companies are talking to each other, and I think we're making progress. We're hopeful that we'll get a bill through the Senate and that it will crystallize some of these issues and resolve them. Thanks.
David, Jim talked about the possibility of putting a fee on electricity to pay for R&D. I'm wondering if you can just give us your back-of-the-envelope calculation. When people talk about these allowances, we know it's big. How big is the value of these allowances?
Well,
what are we talking about?
There's you know, a lot of modelers doing a lot of modeling of this, but a sort of rule of thumb that we use is the cap under Lieberman Warner would start at about 5.7 billion tons per year in 2012. It's a phenomenal amount, actually. And if each one of those allowances was worth $10, you're talking about $50 billion a year. If each one is worth $20, $100 billion a year. And the cap declines. This is one of the major points of agreement that I would note here, the idea that we ought to have a cap and trade and it would decline in a predictable way over time. So the number of allowances goes down. In fact, if it goes down by 60 to 80%, it goes down to 2 or 1 billion tons. And for some period of time, those allowances will get more valuable per ton as the scarcity increases. But as the technology comes on, I mean, there's not much value. I'm trying to think of a good old example without going back to the horse and buggy era. But there's not much value to horse feed. We get to a post-carbon set of technologies, these carbon allowances are actually going to become less valuable, not more, because we won't need them.
But in the short term, they're a large amount of money.
Yeah, it's $100 billion a year.
But David's made kind of an interesting point. He says that at $30 is what they predict the Lieberman-Warner bill would be. That's $150 million just under their scenario.
Well, the EIA assessment out today is $15 to $17.
I know, but the majority of the studies say 30. Let's just say it's 150. And this gets really to what this is all about. The allowance issue is not about the environment, it's about economics. And we need to remember that. And the $150 billion is far more than we need and we can deploy to develop technology. It's really about using it for other purposes. And a lot of politicians see this as a middle-class tax reduction. They see it a way to redistribute wealth in this country. They see it as an opportunity to use it for earmarks. They see it for an opportunity to use it for anything but addressing our ecological crisis that we face. And one of the things that I find so troubling, and this will allow us to draw a distinction right at the beginning, is that when you do this auction, let's not be fooled about what an auction is. 100% auction is a carbon tax. It will fall disproportionately on people that are in the 25 states that use more than 50% of the coal, 50% of the electricity comes from the use of coal. Their rates will go up 40, 60, and 80%. There will be huge rate shock and dislocation in those regions of the country. And when people talk about the auctions, at the end of the day, we need to put it in a quick context. Go back with me to 1970. It was the national policy of our country to build coal plants, and people built coal plants. And it was the national policy of our country and the state policy to use affordable, reliable electricity, and they were focused on low costs. So state commissioners said, build coal plants. The question is, do you want today to punish people who carried out national policy and state policy, to punish families, businesses, because they carried out Project Independence when we were weaning ourselves from foreign oil, remember in the 70s? And we said, build coal, build nuclear. And then 3 Mile Island happened and we didn't build nuclear. We built coal. And now to come back today and to punish those people for carrying out national policy, in my judgment's wrong. I think the reality is, and this is what I fear, if the 100% auction or our heavy auction where the burden is on the consumers of the 25 states in the Midwest and the Southeast, the industrial heartland, we will never get legislation. And we won't address this. If it's punitive, and then the answer is, even if there's a feel-good vote and we get legislation, there will be a political backlash. And at the end of the day, we will not be able to stay the course on addressing this issue. So I feel strongly, and my last point is, I feel strongly because my first job after I clerked for the Supreme Court in my home state was I became the state's consumer advocate fighting rate increases of utility companies in the 70s. And in many senses of the word, I sit here as a CEO of a company who's regulated in the 5 states that we operate in, and where every allowance that's allocated will go to reduce the price of electricity to the consumers. They will get the full benefit of it. Not a single SO2 allowance went into the pocket of our investors. Not a single, and I would put this in blood, I would write this oath in blood, every CO2 allowance that goes to the Midwest and to the Southeast will go to the consumers, as it did with SO2. Because I think at the end of the day, we need to help build a bridge. Because the problem is, I sit here today as a consumer advocate on behalf of our consumers, and I see it through the eyes of our consumers who are going to have 40, 60, 80% rate increases. These allowances need to be used for that transition. Any other way to use it is wrong.
So, Ralph, we've heard a dispassionate view from Jim on this question.
I don't feel strongly.
What do you think on this topic?
Well, I think it would be a serious mistake if we tried to characterize the debate as one region of the country versus another. We produce 25% of our electricity from coal, and I think that people who use electricity that is carbon intensive need to realize that there's a cost that they are creating in the environment that they need to pay for. What I like about using the auction approach is that you couple the cost associated with using carbon with the revenues that are generated for other social benefits. And I don't think we should fret about percentage increases. I think we should worry about the dollars that people pay in their bills. So whether somebody in New Jersey has a 10% increase or somebody in Kentucky has a 40% increase isn't the right calculus. The question is, what's their income level compared to the bill that they're paying, and do they need help making ends meet? Because I think we're all pretty facile at doing multiplication, and I dare say there's probably a bunch of states that I could do 50% rate increases that'll still be paying less than some financially challenged folks in New York City, Philadelphia, or Jackson, Mississippi. So what I really think we want to focus on is kind of tried and true regulatory policies of the past. You know, some people take shots and say polluter pays. Let's say emitter pays. And then take that revenue stream and do what you need to do with it. You're not going to be able to get 80% reductions by having life go on as usual. There are going to be increased costs. So that's going to be a burden to some consumers, disproportionate to what they can bear. Help them. It's going to be a burden to other consumers, which may mean less disposable income in other areas. That's reality. We cannot sit here, I can't sit here and say to you, zero transportation depending upon fossil fuels, zero electricity consumption, no growth in electricity, and we can't get to 2050. And oh, by the way, I've got a solution for you that isn't going to result in higher rates for customers. It will result in higher rates for customers. Other than energy efficiency, it will produce higher costs. Let those costs be proportional to the usage of those technologies that are creating the problem. That will send the right signal to the customer, that will send the right signal to the producer, and that will then free up revenues to invest in R&D and to invest and to give money to low income. A flat wires charge, with all due respect, Jim, I mean, you've been a CEO longer than I have, and you're a lot smarter at this stuff than I am, but why should somebody whose electricity is being fed by a wind farm in West Texas pay the same fee as somebody who's tapped into a coal plant? It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, that wind isn't generating any CO2.
But I think you have to look at it in the standpoint this is a national problem, not a regional problem, and that we have to take the world as we find it today. And in the same way, it is not morally right for us in the United States to tell the people in China and India they shouldn't aspire to the same GDP per capita in the future. I don't think we have a right today to punish those who made decisions carrying out national policy decades ago.
Well,
I think that the important point here, and I think about our service area territory, the average or the median income is about $42,000 a year. I'm looking at that through their eyes, and I'm looking at this as a transition. The most important point I would make is this. Should we ask those people to pay twice for the transition to a low-carbon world? They're going to have to pay once now under a 100% auction approach, or a carbon tax, because it's the same. And they're going to have to pay again when you retrofit those units, when the technology is available 15 years from now, or when you tear that unit down and build a new unit. So what I'm trying to avoid is having those consumers in 25 states, and by the way, in those 25 states, 21 of them are regulated, where when you give the money to the utility, it goes directly to the consumer and not to the company. And there was a recent letter from NARUC that expressed that reality in those states. And quite frankly, it becomes a low-cost way to do this, because what the government has contemplated, and I've talked to both some of the advisors to the presidential candidates who are advocating 100% auctions, and what they basically want to do is to have utility companies basically raise their rates, have 150, 200, 300, 400 billion go into the coffers in Washington. And then they want to write the checks in Washington and get credit for kind of helping out. That envisions a bureaucracy that looks like the IRS. And quite frankly, what was done under SO2 was far more efficient and got to the customers and helped make the transition. And if you look at where we are today, we've got 70% reduction in SO2, and we've done it in a way that didn't punish the consumers who carried that burden. That's our challenge, is to be able to make that transition without forcing these people who are affected to pay twice.
David.
Well, Jim, you're not addressing the exact proposal, which I'm referring to. Maybe I didn't state it exactly enough, and which I think is being contemplated. And that is that if you think about what entity within the electric system would receive these allowances, it makes a difference, at least I believe it makes a difference, whether it's to the generators or to the local utility. And if the local...
They're one and the same in regulated states.
That's right. So in that case, it should be of no matter to you.
Right.
But if it is not one and the same, and also the question is, well, what happens to those allowances? The proposition is that some of the value should flow back to people in rate relief, or non-rate increases, let's put it that way, not raising their rates. And some of it should actually be sold, let the rates reflect it, but let the benefit not go to Washington and come back indirectly in some uncertain way in your example, but instead to be managed and implemented by the local utility under the oversight of its, and over the rules set by the public utilities commissions in each state, and have those rules be ones which use that kind of money, significant money, to speed up the implementation of energy efficient appliances and building shells and windows and all the other good stuff that is underutilized, that would hold down the demand, make it unnecessary to generate so much electricity and so many emissions. And some of the money would also be available to, under the Lieberman-Warner bill, a lot of money, to assist companies that take up the challenge of putting the pieces together and building the first plants with carbon capture and storage to pump the, as I sometimes say, to stick it where the sun don't shine. And to those companies that do that first would be the beneficiaries of a very large bonus in allowances that they in turn can sell and raise the capital to pay for that investment and to take the risk of being early movers. As the number of these plants grows, the bonus goes down. So it seems, we may not have got it quite right, but it seems to be a sound way to deal with the problem that you are putting your finger on rightly, that there's a big investment in new generating capacity needed, and the allowance value can be used to help that happen.
I would agree with that approach. I think the auction is more efficient economically from the point of view of transparent and clear price signals, but if the policymakers can't agree, then allocating it to load, the jargon that we tend to use, to the local distribution company, both in regulated and unregulated markets, makes enormous sense. Then what you're basically saying is, look, we're going to give it to the consumer through the regulatory commissioner, and that would work. I think that would make sense.
So what we've talked about here, once we have agreement on the need for big reductions.
In the last 5 minutes, we broke the
Mindy's rule.
Mindy's rule about using English. But
that's true. So I'm going to try to simplify here. So I think that the first thing that we heard a lot of agreement on, as David Doniger pointed out, was the need to make big and long-term reductions, 60 to 80% by 2050. Sounds to me like what we spent a lot of time talking about is that there's going to be a fair amount of money flowing around in the system here. Maybe it's $100 billion, something big. And the issue is that we've got multiple needs that we might want to deal with in developing climate policy. One is that there are some people who are going to pay more money on their electricity bills as a result of this, and perhaps elsewhere in the economy. We've talked about a lot of electricity, but it will happen in transportation as well. And so there's a possibility of having money for making sure those bills don't go up so much as they might otherwise. And we heard a lot about the importance of trying to get technology either researched and developed, or as David Doniger was just talking about, getting it out there more quickly than it might be if you just had a research and development program. So it seems like what we've been talking about in relatively arcane ways is simply how do we figure out how to deal with the needs that we think are going to be out there, and what's the most efficient way to do it, and that's the essence of the debate here. So that was my simplistic summary of it, but what did I miss? What did I miss, Ralph?
No, I think you hit it right on the head. The one piece that you miss if you focus exclusively on making sure the consumer reaction is mitigated is the reality that part of what we ought to be doing is sending a signal to the consumer to use less. So to kind of, on the one hand, say we want them to use less and we want to reduce CO2, but then we don't want them to feel it, is I don't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason why we advocate for not giving all of it to the consumer and to leave some for the producers on the basis of output is that they will effectively deploy capital. They will make sure that those resources then go in to those technologies that can produce electricity. I think David's right, by the way, the energy services is the end game, without emitting carbon. And you then, so the question becomes, are you trying to get to 350 parts per million by 2050 and 80% reduction? And will you do that if all you do is take money out of one hand of the consumer and then return it into another hand? I think you got to be a little careful of that.
I think the point here is, though, that the cap comes down over time. It's not like it stays at this level for a long period, and we all know that. But you have to get the cap tied to the availability of new technology. And if carbon capture and sequestration, which I'm optimistic about, proves to not, it doesn't get developed because there's no public acceptance of it, and that's a big issue that we need to debate. But at the end of the day, we need some transition period. And as I started out by saying, what I'm talking about is a transition. Yes, I can see auctions in the out years. Yes, I can see the cap coming down as technologies come on board. Yes, I can see keeping it simple. But what people are talking about today, when you start talking 150 billion or 200 billion or 300 billion, let me tell you, there is an unholy trinity that comes together. It's the politicians who have visions of sugar plums dancing in their head in terms of how they can use this money, and I should say for everything but to deal with this issue. And the second group is the commodity traders. The oil price today, some say about 30% of the current oil price is tied to speculating in oil. If you have a robust auction at the beginning, and you have, and Wall Street loves this, they're on the Hill lobbying right now for 100% auctions because they want to bid the price up. Because have you ever seen a commodity trader that bought something and sold it for less? So my bet is if we're projecting the price will be $15 a ton or $30 a ton, it'll be $40 by the time it goes through the auction process. So that's the other one. And then there's the group of people that have a simple way to deal with this. Well, let's just punish the polluter. And this is the best way to do it, is just pile the cost on them. It doesn't matter if it's a 60% increase or 80% increase. Let's just pile the costs on them and maybe they'll do the right thing, as Ralph is saying. But quite frankly, without the technology, there is no right thing to do other than to have to pay, and think about my customers, $42,000 a year median income to deal with a 60 to 80% price increase. So remember what we're talking about. We're not talking about environmental policy. We're talking about economics. And this discussion we're having is about how do we get the economics right so we don't end up hurting our economy, our segments of our economy, and that's got to be the challenge that we have. And my last point is this. My fear when I listen to the complicated sort of formula, David, that you're talking about, I watched how well the politicians connected the dots on corn ethanol. Didn't do a very good job, did they? This is far more complex than that, And I fear that it won't connect the dots, and the unintended consequences are far more perverse in our country and around the world if they don't connect the dots. And when it gets more complicated, as I see the Lieberman bill and I listen, this much over here and this much over here and this and this, I'm kind of old-fashioned and Midwestern. Let's make it simple. Let's do what's worked. SO2 worked. Let's decouple the fundraising from the cap and trade. And let's get this job done. And let's connect the dots and don't make the mistakes that Congress made with corn ethanol.
So what I missed, David?
Well, I think it is about environmental policy. And here's one point, at least, that I hear, and I'd like to kind of, draw something out with you, Jim. You talk about the need to get the technology first. Now, that translates in many proposals to a conditional cap, a cap that doesn't come down until somebody's proved that each of these technologies works. And that leaves us in a kind of, in my opinion, a voluntary trap that we were in before the SO2 system came along. There were people back in 1990, when that bill went through, who still thought scrubbers didn't work. We ought to wait till they were really proved, and the technology wasn't there, and it was going to be awfully expensive if we put this cap on. But there is an important difference between a policy which comes in and says, here are the reductions, here are the economic consequences. Because of those economic consequences, here is your opportunity if you make these technologies work. Compare that to a policy that says you don't have to face those cuts until you agree, or somebody agrees, that the technology has been demonstrated. That, to me, is a recipe for an extended delay. And we will see this June, at least we're expecting to see, a proposal from Senator Voinovich, which is built on this principle that the cuts don't come until somebody, some referee out there, declares that the technology is ready. And I think that sends the wrong signals to those who have the capital and should be implementing the technology. It's true, it could always fail. There's always a possibility that it could fail. But that's why there is and there should be a portfolio of technologies to choose from so that not everything rides on one horse. And we've shown over and over again that when the requirements create the market signal, whether it's SO2, whether it's the phase out of ozone-depleting chemicals, other examples, the technology comes because the market is filled with, marketplace is filled with people who want to make money, making things work, instead of people who want to put off regulations by arguing that things can't work.
No, I agree with your point, actually. And it's more of an art, David, to bring this down. And I actually supported the Clean Air Act amendments, the only CEO in our industry that did, I might say, in 1989 and 90. And my memory is that we have reduced, in our company, our emissions of SO2 70%, but we didn't take the first or the second generation. We bought the allowances as the cap came down, and then we built the third generation of scrubbers, and today we spent $5 billion retrofitting our units and reducing SO2. But there was some art in crafting it, and I think we have to set some targets, and I'm in your camp in thinking about it that way.
Let's turn, if we could, to, I think, do we have time, Gordon, for a couple of questions from the audience? Yeah, okay. So, Betsy, you've got the microphone, so you're going to control this. If you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Okay. I'm Leslie Haroon from the Oak Foundation. And Jim, my question is for you. I just want to start out by saying that I'm compelled by your vision of passing policy at the same time that we start funneling massive amounts of money into new technologies. I agree we can't wait for 2012 or 2014 to start working on the technologies. However, as I know you're aware, there's a new debate about what the tipping point is. whether it's 350 parts per million or 450 parts per million, and we're already over 350 parts per million. So what I would argue is that within the next decade, or by 2012, that in addition to focusing on new technologies, one of the most important things we can do is not lose this battle, which means that it's important to not lock in new carbon emissions. And one of the most important ways to do that is to stop new coal facilities from being built unless they can capture and store their carbon. So my question for you is, given that, and I know you know this, and given Duke Energy's membership in US CAP, how can you reconcile building 2 new coal-fired power plants?
That's a very good question. And there's a paradox here in this. I mean, how on the one hand can I be so aggressive about carbon regulation, on the other hand build coal plants? Here's the way I justify it to myself and reconcile it. And I've struggled with this, quite frankly. My job one for me is to make sure there's affordable, reliable, and clean energy. I don't have the luxury of just focusing on affordability or focusing just on reliability or just on clean. I have to balance those 3 things. Let me take the North Carolina example. There we're building an 800 megawatt coal plant. It's 30% more efficient than the plants that we have. And so our carbon footprint per kWh goes down. But I would not have supported the building of that plant without the other commitment that we made, and that's to shut down 1,000 megawatts of much older coal plants that we had not retrofitted for SOx, NOx, and mercury because they were so old. And so we would probably never retrofit them for CO2. So in my mind, I got comfortable with building this more efficient plant of 800 megawatts with a commitment to shut down 1,000 megawatts, and to make a commitment that my carbon footprint wouldn't be any bigger. My amount of electricity I generate will be greater, but the carbon intensity of it would be less. So I justified that because our SOx, NOx, and mercury footprint looks like this with the old plants. By shutting them down and having the new plant, it looks more like that. And also because we've had river issues, as you know, we've had a drought for 2 or 3 years in the southeast. That's been a problem. So, and this allows us to take one of the units off of the Catawba watery system, which is, we have a keener appreciation of how fragile it is. So it was a series of trade-offs that got me to that place. On the coal plant in Indiana, it's a series of trade-offs also. There, we are going to shut down, we're going to go to a brownfield site, and what we're building is a coal gasification facility. It will be the world's largest coal gasification facility. It does a better job than any other coal technology in terms of SOx, NOx, and mercury, in terms of taking that out. And those pollutants are still important, I believe. But the most important thing about this coal plant is it is going to be built in the middle of the coal fields. And we're going to offer up that site to do carbon sequestration. The MIT study made a very powerful point. It said if we don't do major sequestration projects, we're not ever going to be able to bring that technology online. So what we have committed to do is to use that plant and to use that site in the middle of the coal fields with perfect geology to do the largest sequestration project that's been done in the world. And I think that helps us advance the cause. We also will shut down 170 megawatts on that site. And as we look out, we see 300 to 400 megawatts, and this is just a 630 megawatt plant, that we will probably retire contemporaneous with this plant coming online. So I view this more as a modernization. I view this as putting my money where my mouth is in terms of investing in new technologies and experimenting with sequestration.
Will that one have CCS when it starts up?
No, it won't, because we're in the process of designing it, and we're going to use it as a site to put a CCS unit on. The debate is, do we do it on 20% of it or 40% of it? And the debate, because this technology, sequestration technology, has never been scaled up. So this is a scaling question, and this offers one of the best sites in the country to do the scaling. So from my standpoint, I justify that plant because it's new technology. The last thing I would say about the 385 point and the 455.50. Professor Lovelock said something to me that struck me and gives me a greater sense of urgency on the mitigation and adaptation. But he made a very interesting point that I haven't really heard scientists talk about. He said that we often think that when carbon goes up, that we will slow the rise in carbon, we will stop it, and we will reverse it, and everything will be good. He says, not so quick. He says what happens as the carbon goes up, Earth is like a biological organism in the sense that the equilibrium restabilizes at the higher levels, and that an actual reduction may not necessarily result in the new equilibrium going back to the prior equilibrium. We don't quite know where it settles out. That has left me with, that had a profound impact on me, because that says simply that once we get to this level, and by the way, the Chinese in the next 8 years are going to build 1,000 cliffside plants, and they're not going to retire anything. If you look at the amount of CO2, and 76% of it's coming from the developing world in the next, between now and 2030, that I think we got a fundamental problem, and that adaptation is going to be a huge part of the solution, because I'm not confident that the equilibrium, even if we're able to reduce it, gets us back to where we were before. So that's a concern I have that is part of your question.
So one of the things that Ceres is going to do for everybody who's participated in this workshop is to print a new certification form. You're going to be all certified climate policy wonks for having participated in this session. And while Gordon comes up and tells us what we're going to do next, I just want you to thank our professors, Ralph Izzo, Jim Rogers, and David Doniger, for doing a great job. That was good. He takes all the heat.
What a great way to finish our day, or at least workshop-wise and plenary-wise. Thank you very much. Excellent.